Welcome to this calf rearing full performance webinar brought to you by NZAgbiz, presented by Dr Sue McCord from AgResearch and Michael Shallcrass from Fonterra. Mike is a veterinary program manager with an extensive background in veterinary science. Mike is passionate about identifying and promoting the best farming practices across New Zealand, working closely with Kiwi farmers to ensure sustainable and successful outcomes for their herds. Sue is a senior scientist at AgResearch, who has spent much of her career researching livestock rearing, survival and nutrition for animals raised for the meat and dairy industries. Sue is passionate about sharing this expertise to empower farmers and drive innovation in animal care and nutrition.
The next topic we're going to cover is the benefits of feeding calves more milk. So when calves are born, most of their stomachs, we talk about how cattle have got 4 stomachs. So most of the stomachs of a newborn calf are made up by the abomasum, or the true stomach, and that's kind of the equivalent of the human stomach. It's got the acid there to digest, break down fats and proteins. The superpower of the ruminant really, though, is in the rumen. That gives these animals the ability to digest and get nutrients out of grass, which is something that normally they wouldn't be able to. But when calves are first born, their rumen's really small. It's not a big part of their gut, and they're unable to digest pasture at that point in their lives. They've got to derive almost all of their nutrition from milk. And what we're trying to do when you're thinking about rearing calves is get them to the point where their rumen is able to digest enough feed that they can survive and thrive on that fibrous feed without compromising that early growth rate when they're still dependent on milk. So it's how do you strike that balance between driving rumen development, but also ensuring that calves are getting enough nutrition from the milk that they're so dependent on, particularly for the first few weeks.
That's right, Mike. And just to illustrate how important getting the liquid feed into the calf in the first few weeks of life, and that liquid feed might be whole milk, it might be transition milk, it might be milk replacer. But this graph here shows the 2 lines, horizontal lines. There's a blue one and an orange one. This is relating to the milk intake, and in this particular study that was done in Australia very recently, they fed calves either 8 litres of whole milk or 4 litres of whole milk. And they monitored the performance of the calves, but also the intake of their solid feed. So that solid feed is what will drive rumen development. The 2 lines you can see there is a green one for meal, so meal or otherwise known as concentrate, and a blue line for hay. And what you can see if you move along horizontally is that in the first 4 to 5 weeks of age, independent of whether the calf is being fed 4 litres of milk a day or 8 litres of milk a day, their intake of solid feed is really low. So it's less than 200 grams a day. And it's not until that calf gets to about 6 or 7 weeks of age that they actually start to consume a lot more of that solid feed and drive that rumen development. And so that enables them to be able to utilize the nutrients from that solid feed alongside the milk to be able to drive growth. So the key part here is that in that first 5 to 6 weeks, milk is king. So why is milk king? So more milk builds bigger, stronger, healthier calves. So in that study that I was just talking about, where they fed whole milk at either 8 or 4 litres a day for 10 weeks, the difference there was that the calves were 19 kilos heavier at weaning, so that was at 10 weeks, and that was driven by those early growth rates and was a result of that higher level of milk intake. These calves also had better immune and metabolic function, which means they were healthier and there was less disease. There's been a number of studies, and there's just some examples from different peer-reviewed publications just listed along the bottom of the slide there, that are reinforcing the importance of feeding more milk in this pre-weaning phase for health of and well-being of the animal and growth rates, but also to improve the welfare. And some studies have shown that those calves that get more milk, they show less signs of hunger, they play more, and appear to be healthier and happier. But also, in addition to the benefits pre-weaning, many studies now in the last decade or so, particularly in the last 5 years, and these are studies from around the world and all sorts of different types of farming systems, whether they be outdoor pastoral systems or indoor TMR type systems like in Europe or in the US, that feeding a calf more milk before it is weaned and driving up average daily gain or growth rate also has a flow-on effect for their future performance. And the type of benefits that these studies have been able to show is improved fat yield, improved fat and protein corrected milk yield, improving first conception rate quite significantly from 13 to 41%, which is quite a biggie in terms of our fertility of our herds, and also the longevity of the cows. The studies were showing, very recent studies showed the risk of culling was halved before the third calving for calves that grew faster prior to weaning than those calves that didn't grow fast prior to weaning.
So hopefully there's enough evidence there to kind of point out why we'd like calves to be growing well and growing rapidly before weaning. But then there's another question here around kind of like, when is your best growth rate or when is your best feed conversion efficiency happen? And actually, the younger a calf is, the more of whatever feed you give it, it's going to turn into body weight compared to just being needed for maintenance requirements. And so if you look at this graph that we've got here around that feed conversion efficiency, you can see it drops off quite quickly. And so you're going to get more growth for a given amount of feed if you prioritize it to your younger calves. You know, the same amount of feed given to a 1-week-old calf is going to result in more growth than if you'd given that feed to a 4-week-old calf. So this kind of pulls together, you know, that really young calves get almost all of their nutrition from milk. That getting young calves to grow quickly early on has significant benefits later in their life. And because they need all their nutrition from milk, then really that's kind of, we need to prioritize that milk feeding at that young age and make sure they're kind of getting as much as they can, rather than as little as you can get away with, which has often been the approach that some farmers have taken, you know, up until now.
And just to sort of take you through an example of how a young calf utilizes the milk that we feed them, there's essentially two main uses of that milk. The first is to meet their maintenance requirements. So that's just basically to survive. And then there's the component of the milk that we feed them that enables them to grow. So in other words, not just survive, but to thrive. And so in this example, what I've done is I've used 1,200 grams of milk powder. So that would be the equivalent of feeding a calf 8 litres of milk replacer mixed at 150 grams per litre in a day, and trying to look at what can that amount of milk replacer support. So for a 40 kilo calf, about 420 grams of that 1,200 is just used to maintain just basic body functions. And the remainder of that milk that they're consuming is used for growth rate. And so a rough rule of thumb, it's about half of that surplus amount of milk powder is the equivalent of growth rate. So if you've got about 780 grams of powder available for growth, that will translate into around about 400 grams a day growth rate. But it's important to recognize that the requirements in terms of milk to meet those maintenance and growth requirements does depend on two critical things. One is how warm it is. If a calf is cold, it's going to be using more nutrition to be able to keep warm. And also if there is a high disease load. And we've talked before with colostrum around how important it is to feed that immune system. As a calf is growing, it's still developing its own immune system. And that's a very nutritionally hungry exercise for the calf. And so if that calf is in a high disease environment or is fighting infection or is mounting an immune response and following a vaccination, for example, they're going to use more nutrients for that over and above what they need for maintenance. So a key point to be thinking about here is if we're feeding a low milk allowance, so for example, if we're only feeding 4 litres of milk a day, mixed at the same rate, 150 grams per litre, that means the calf gets 600 grams per day. If a 40 kilo calf is needing 420 odd grams of that just to maintain basic body functions, that's only leaving 180 grams of those milk solids for growth and also for keeping warm on cold days and for fighting disease. So for those animals that are not getting a lot of milk, they're likely to have or will have much lower growth rates, but also greater risk of not being able to cope with cold environments and an increased risk of disease.
That cold aspect is pretty significant, because we calve seasonally and most calves are born during the cold time of the year. So, if you kind of extrapolating what Sue was talking about in the last slide, but further, a 40 kilo calf in a 0 degree environment needs 1.5 litres more milk per day to grow at the same rate than that same calf in a 20 degree environment. And so every drop in temperature that we see, you've got to add in extra milk powder to keep that calf warm to compensate for the extra energy that they'll be spending just trying to maintain their own body temperature. So being cold can have a really significant impact on growth rates because they tend to, because they're cumulative. If they slowly fall further and further behind as you have more and more days of cold stress. And remembering cattle on the whole, adult cattle are quite resistant to cold temperature because they're big and they've got a big rumen which is generating all this heat. But as we talked about before, the calves are small, they're often wet when they're born. Well, they are wet when they're born, and they don't have that rumen development yet to kind of create the extra heat. So that's why your shed infrastructure is so important, that you've got no drafts in your shed. The calves have got some solid partitions they can shelter against, and they've got some nice deep bedding that they can snuggle down into to keep warm, because it has a really significant impact on the amount of energy that's available for them to spend on growth and immunity. So that's, I guess, an additional reason to kind of look after your infrastructure and set your whole farm up for to be welcoming for these calves, is because they'll grow faster if you can keep them warm.
And the other thing that we need to bear in mind when we're thinking about feeding calves more milk is going back to what Mike was mentioning earlier around the importance of driving rumen development. So ultimately what we're wanting to do is to set that calf up so that we can wean it off milk and get it to function effectively on the solid feeds, usually starter or pastures ultimately. Now, as we know, solid feed intake does drive that rumen development and is essential for that weaning. And so there has been often concern about, well, how much milk is too much milk? And if I feed too much milk, how is that going to affect the solid feed intake of the calf and therefore rumen development? And it's a really good question. And it's not something that has got a very easy answer in terms of how much milk is too much milk. But research studies have shown that milk intakes above about 8 or 9 litres a day may impact solid feed intake, but not in every study. So I think it does depend on a lot of factors in terms of how warm or cold the environment is, how much pasture they're being offered, what type of system they're in. But most studies would suggest that up to 8 litres is not usually going to have too much of an impact on solid feed intake. And as we said earlier, the intake of their solid feed is pretty low up to that 6 weeks of age, irrespective of the type of feed that they're getting. But it's when you get closer to weaning that we've got to be quite careful, especially if we're feeding high milk volumes. We don't want to be looking at weaning a calf that's being fed 8 litres of milk a day when they're only 6 weeks old, because they're not going to have enough room and development to be able to cope with that weaning effectively. So we need to wean them a little bit later, or we need to look at step down weaning. So your step down weaning is where you gradually reduce the amount of milk that's on offer to the calf. And it's recommended to do that over at least 2 or 3 weeks if you can, just so that we can support the metabolic system of the calf, and also so that calf has time to compensate by not having as much milk in their diet by consuming more solid feed, whether that be starter diet or pasture or other forms of solid feed. So it just helps to support that transition from a pre-ruminant through to being a fully functional ruminant and being able to cope without milk.
Takeaways from the section, I think, you know, the idea that you get better growth rates and you get more resilient calves who are ultimately better contributors to the herd if you feed them more milk and more meal when they're young. And it's not necessarily an or, it's an and thing here. That the stuff that you feed them should be good quality, so that ensures that, you know, it's well digestible, and therefore the calves are going to be able to get more out of it. Compartmentalized cafeterias, really useful for ensuring that calves are getting at least their allotted amount, particularly with those young calves who are, you know, if you've got a slower drinker in there, they're more susceptible to you know, bullying or pushing off the calf feeder. And then grouping calves by age and size is going to kind of help with that as well, making sure they're all kind of about the same level of development. And consistency. So consistency is really, really important when you're feeding calves. So that's consistent temperature, consistent feeding volumes, consistent feeding times, because their gut is still developing and it's learning how it's going to digest this food, and sudden changes, you know, the kind of the internal enzyme processes and things like that are not flexible enough yet to cope with sudden changes. You may need to offer more milk during cold weather. That you could also think about taking other steps to support calves there. So making sure your infrastructure isn't cold, warming milk, although what we just said about consistency, keeping that in mind. And if you've got calves outside, you know, or even in the shed, use of jackets or something like that to try and support them when it's particularly cold. Step down weaning, really important. So any changes that you make should be gradual. As we said, you know, consistency is really important here. So gradual weaning will allow the calves the opportunity to slowly ramp up their solid feed intake at the same time, so you don't get that post-weaning growth check that's so common. And then, how do you know if any of the stuff's working? You have to measure some things. Measure how much they're drinking, measure how much they're eating, you know, ideally weigh them, and see if any of them are falling behind the group who might need some extra TLC, or ones who are growing fast. Maybe you need to have a look at them and go, or are they pushing the other ones out? And is there a group dynamic thing here that we need to be looking at? You know, the calves will tell you how hungry they are.